Okay, we're about to dive into a story that really, really pushes our legal system to its absolute limit. It's a story that almost had a completely unthinkable ending.
Just think about that question for a second. Could a serial killer, a guy who confessed to murdering dozens of women, actually be set free legally? It sounds impossible, right? Like a failure of the system so profound you can't even believe it could happen.
Well, in 2006, one almost did. His name was Carl Eugene Watts, and this is the story of how a confessed killing machine almost walked right out of prison and the absolutely desperate race against the clock to stop him.
So, to really get what was at stake here, we've got to go back. We need to understand the man at the very center of this whole thing.
Look at this number, over 100. By some estimates, that's how many women Carl Corell Watts murdered between 1974 and 1982. Now, if that's true, we're talking about one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. He only officially confessed to 13 as part of a plea deal, but he later hinted that the real number was much, much higher.
They called him the Sunday morning slasher. The newspapers in Ann Arbor gave him that nickname because so many of his attacks happened around 4 a.m. on Sunday mornings. And this guy, he stalked and killed women across multiple states. He even went into Canada. He used all kinds of horrifying methods: stabbing, strangulation, bludgeoning, drowning. He was a predator, plain and simple, and he just left this trail of terror absolutely everywhere he went.
And, a huge part of how he got away with it for so long was his mobility. Look at this timeline. You have to remember, this was an era before national DNA databases, before police departments could instantly share information. So his constant moving around, it made it almost impossible for law enforcement to connect the dots. They just couldn't see the terrifying pattern he was leaving behind.
So the big question is, how did this all finally end? Well, you might think it was some brilliant piece of detective work, but it wasn't. It came down to an act of just incredible bravery.
Get this, on May 23, 1982, one of his intended victims, a woman named Melinda Aguilar, escaped by jumping from a second-story balcony with her hands tied behind her back. Can you imagine? That single jump didn't just save her life, it saved her roommate, Lori Lister, who Watts was literally trying to drown in the bathtub at that very moment. That one act of desperation is what finally ended his rampage and put him in police custody.
But this is where the story takes a really wild turn. The prosecutors in Texas, they were worried. They just didn't think they had enough physical evidence to get a murder conviction. So they offered him a deal, and it's probably one of the most controversial plea bargains you'll ever hear about. Here's the deal. In exchange for full immunity on all the murder charges, Watts would confess to everything, give closure to the families. And what charge would he get? Burglary with intent to murder. It was a terrible choice, right? A guaranteed 60-year sentence for burglary, or risk this guy, this killer, walking free entirely. The judge was furious. He sentenced Watts to the maximum, 60 years, and said, "I hope they put you so deep in the penitentiary that they'll have to pipe sunlight to you." He was sure, absolutely sure, that Watts would never see the outside of a prison cell again. But he was wrong, because that deal, the one that was supposed to keep this monster locked away forever, well, it had a hidden flaw. It was like a time bomb ticking away inside the legal paperwork, one that would nearly cause a catastrophic failure of justice. So here's how this insane loophole worked. It all started with a legal technicality from a totally separate case. Remember how the judge had used the bathtub water as a deadly weapon to make the sentence stick? Well, years later, because of that other case, Watts was able to appeal it. And once that deadly weapon finding was removed, the system, on a technicality, no longer considered him a violent offender. And that's the key. That change triggered an old Texas good time law, and suddenly, his 60-year sentence just started to melt away. And what did that mean? It meant that Carl Eugene Watts, a man who confessed to being a serial killer, was scheduled for mandatory release on May 9, 2006. The very system that locked him up was now legally forced to open the door and let him walk right out. The deal had backfired in the absolute worst way you can imagine. So you can just imagine the panic. With the clock literally ticking down, officials in Michigan, where crucially Watts did not have an immunity deal, they launched a desperate nationwide public appeal. Listen to what Michigan's Attorney General said. This man is a confessed killing machine who has promised to kill again. Their only hope, their only shot, was to find a new case, a murder that wasn't covered by that Texas immunity deal.
So they went public, basically begging for a forgotten witness, any piece of a cold case, anything to keep him locked up. And the clock was ticking down fast.
And then, just when it seemed hopeless, a breakthrough. A guy named Joseph Foy is at home, just watching the news, and he sees the story about Watts getting out. And it triggers something. A memory from a cold night way back in December 1979. He'd actually witnessed the murder of a 36-year-old woman named Helen Dutcher. He'd even helped the police with a sketch of the attacker, but the case just went cold for decades. And what did he remember so clearly? The killer's eyes. He described them as evil and totally devoid of emotion. That one haunting memory just burned into his brain for 25 years. That was the key. Joseph Foy came forward, and he gave Michigan the testimony they desperately needed to finally put Watts on trial for a murder he couldn't hide from.
So now, armed with this incredibly powerful new testimony, prosecutors finally had their chance to make sure Carl Watts would die in prison.
And they didn't waste it. In November 2004, they convicted him for the murder of Helen Dutcher. He got life without parole. Then they did it again. In 2007, they convicted him for the 1974 murder of Gloria Steele, another life sentence. The state of Michigan prosecuted him not once, but twice for these decades-old crimes. And with those 2 life sentences, they slammed that loophole shut for good. And just a couple of months after that second conviction, on September 21st, 2007, Carl Eugene Watts died of cancer in a Michigan prison. So justice, even though it was so delayed and nearly denied by a flaw in the system, was finally delivered. The Sunday morning Sasher died behind bars. So Watts was stopped, but it really makes you think, doesn't it? How many other legal loopholes like this are still out there, just waiting to be discovered? This whole case is just a chilling reminder that the justice system, for all its strengths, is a human creation. And because of that, it has flaws, it has technicalities that can have terrifying, unintended consequences. It really forces you to ask, what other ticking time bombs are just hiding in the fine print of the law?